Eventual Reconstruction, which takes place in the first part of the Reconstruction era in 1865 and 1866. Here are your video goals. Let's start by looking at what Abraham Lincoln's idea was for Reconstruction. So unfortunately, he doesn't get to enact his view of Reconstruction because he dies only 6 days after Robert E. Lee surrenders. However, it's still important to look at what his plan was to think about how things might have been different if he did not die. So his view was that the South should enter into the country again as quickly as possible. He wanted to put the whole thing behind them. And for this reason, he was pretty lenient. He wanted to grant amnesty to almost everybody in the Confederacy, maybe to everybody. His basic idea was that we shouldn't hold it against the South, but welcome the South back into the country with open arms. So if anybody who was willing to give an oath of an allegiance to the United States, that is basically to swear loyalty, would be allowed back into the country. And states themselves, which left the country, would be allowed back in according to the 10% rule. And what the 10% rule says is that once 10% of the state's population swears loyalty to the United States, that state will be allowed to rejoin the country and participate in elections. And last of all, Abraham Lincoln sets up the Freedmen's Bureau, which is established in order to help the 4 million recently freed slaves in the South to adapt to life as free people. Let's just take a quick minute to get a closer view of the Freedmen's Bureau, which plays a very important role throughout Reconstruction. It's established in 1865, right around the end of the war, and its main purpose when it's established is to provide humanitarian aid. When the war ends, there are millions of Southern black people who are recently freed slaves who have almost nothing. They lack food, shelter, work, education. So they're poor and they don't really have any way to fix their problems. And the South is, or the country is looking at a major humanitarian catastrophe where there are millions of people without jobs or the ability to feed themselves. And so in order to prevent a major humanitarian catastrophe, Abraham Lincoln authorizes the Freedmen's Bureau to go down there and basically give out food and provide shelter so that people don't die in the first years of Reconstruction. So, one interesting thing is that thousands of white Southerners also rely on the Freedmen's Bureau at first because their homes have been destroyed by Northern armies and also need the services provided by the Freedmen's Bureau. One of the most important things that the Freedmen's Bureau goes on to do, other than passing out basic necessities, is they provide education. Lots and lots of Northern school teachers come down to the South and work to provide a basic education to recently freed slaves. And the idea was that they, by teaching them to read, this would really help them to integrate into life as a group of free people. And former slaves were very eager to read, both because they realized that literacy was an important step towards being successful in the world, but they also were very eager to read because of religious desires to read the Bible. So you might remember that under the slave system in the Old South, most slaves were prevented from learning how to read, even though many of them really wanted to. So this was their chance. And thanks to the Freedmen's Bureau, around 200,000 people are educated in the South and learn to read. There are, however, some serious drawbacks to the Freedmen's Bureau. One is that the Freedmen's Bureau was given the opportunity to give out land to former slaves. And this would have made a huge difference. If the Freedmen's Bureau had given out land, basically they were authorized to give out 40 acres of land to each family. They would have been this would have allowed thousands of free black people to start a new life doing what they did best, and that is farming. Because that's what you got good at when you were a slave, and that was the main skill that many of these people had. However, the Freedmen's Bureau really didn't give out very much land, and that's partially because white landowners who had all the money were willing to bribe the Freedmen's Bureau and take steps to make sure that their land was not given away. And On this measure, they were largely successful, and so very little land ever ended up being transferred from rich white landowners to poor freedmen. Another issue that comes up is Lincoln's assassination. This happens only 6 days after Robert E. Lee surrenders, and it is carried out by this dude. He's a successful actor named John Wilkes Booth, who was also very pro-South. And he shoots Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head in a theater and plunges the nation into deep mourning because they were all celebrating Abraham Lincoln as one of the greatest presidents to ever live. And what this means, the practical impact of this, is that Abraham Lincoln doesn't get to carry out Reconstruction, but rather his vice president, Andrew Johnson, takes over and has to carry out this task. So here is Andrew Johnson. He was born to a poor family in Raleigh, North Carolina, and as a young man moved out to Tennessee and became a successful politician there. He made a name for himself representing poor, non-slave owning whites. And he hated the slave owning elite with a bitter passion. And when the Civil War broke out, he realized that the war was basically just to help the slave owners. So he refused to leave the Union and instead worked for the North during the Civil War. Because of this, he gained some popularity in the North, and he was named as Lincoln's vice president in 1864. And when he comes to power, he takes the stance of being very easy on the South during Reconstruction, even easier than Lincoln was going to be. So he decides to be very lenient and basically lets the South reconstruct themselves. And the period of Reconstruction that occurs during President Johnson's time in office is called Presidential Reconstruction. And during this phase of Reconstruction, Southern states are basically left alone and allowed to do their own thing. The federal government doesn't tell them how to rebuild themselves. And the Southern states are allowed back in easily, and there are very few legal protections provided to Southern black people. And what this means is that the Southern states are able to pass laws that are basically going to reestablish slavery in everything but name. And these laws are known as the Black Codes. And they are the direct result of President Johnson being easy on the South. And so let's take a little bit closer look at the Black Codes. So these were put into place by Southern state governments during presidential Reconstruction. And they were set up to maintain the economic and cultural divide between black and white Southerners. And some examples of things that the Black Codes did was they prevented black people from voting, they limited black legal rights, they limited black employment opportunities, and they outlawed interracial marriage. So the idea was that even though slavery had ended, there would still be a racial divide in the South in which white people got all of the advantages and black people were limited in what they could do and what sort of jobs they could hold. When these laws are noticed by the North, this outrages people. And Congress decides to intervene in order to fix the South. And so they oppose Andrew Johnson and his sort of lenient view towards the South. And they decide they're going to fix the South. And this part of Reconstruction is called Congressional Reconstruction. And that's what we're going to talk about in tomorrow's video.